Hey, Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the 10th week of our series, Faith That Works. It's a series where we're looking at the writings of Jesus' half-brother, James. This week, we took a look at 4 verses in James chapter 5, where James writes about patience. More specifically, how we need to be patient through our suffering. James is writing to Christ followers who live in a culture where it's getting more and more difficult to follow Jesus. And so he tells his readers that it's going to be tough to have a faith that actually works. It's going to be taxing to follow Jesus. He says, but let me coach you and counsel you through it. And so James, he responds to the cries of these Jewish Christians, and this is what he says in chapter 5, verse 7. He says, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming." And then James is going to say, he says, let me give you 3 examples of how to be patient through suffering, or 3 good examples of what that looks like. And so the first analogy, first example he provides us is that of farmers. And so in verse 7, James continues by writing this. He says, "See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord is coming near." So what can we learn about patience through suffering from farmers? Well, first off, as Ethan shared, a farmer knows how to work hard. Farmers keep working even when they don't see any results. Farmers keep working in hopes of a great harvest. Farmers keep working around the clock because it's not a job. In a lot of ways, it's who they are. And so James says, if you want to make it through this life, you got to be patient. But that doesn't just mean sitting around doing nothing, waiting for Christ's return. It means you work hard even though you don't see results. You work hard in hopes of meeting Jesus face to face. You work hard because it's what Christ has actually called you to do. The second thing that we learn from farmers about patience is that we need to actually trust God. You know, a farmer's going to work hard. A farmer's going to do all that they can, but ultimately they have to look at the heavens and recognize that it's out of their control. They have to trust that there are going to be seasonal rains to help their crops actually grow. And they need to have the trust that the right amount of sun is going to reach those crops. The farmer does all that they can and they work hard, but ultimately they have to look to heaven and say, you know, I've done my part and now it's up to God to do the rest. The third thing we see in James's farmer analogy about patience is that farmers never give up. Farmers don't get into a field and halfway through planting, they just don't decide, I'm really not feeling corn this year, let's switch to tomatoes. Once a farmer starts the task, they're committed. They don't allow other options to come in. Why? Because there's a harvest that's coming and they need to be ready for that harvest. So James is communicating that a great way to be patient through suffering is to actually take your cues from a farmer. You got to work hard, you've got to trust God and never give up, because the Lord is coming. There will be a harvest, and so we need to be ready for that. Then James writes this in verse 9. He says, "Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door." What James wants us to know is that the more we do life together, the more opportunities there's going to be for arguments and for friction between us and other people. And so he's warning us that to not turn on each other. Don't talk behind each other's backs. Don't argue over petty differences. He says, don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters. Rather, be patient through your suffering. Give each other grace. Assume the best about each other, because the Lord is coming. Then, in verse 10, James jumps back to giving us examples of what a faith that is patient through suffering actually looks like. And so he says this in verse 10. He says, "Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord." So, what can we learn from the prophets about patience? Well, God had chosen prophets to communicate messages and warnings to the nation of Israel. Israel was a lot like us. They were prone to do life their own way and not God's way. And so God raised up prophets and judges to help guide Israel. One of those prophets was a man named Jeremiah. And Jeremiah comes into the picture around 600 BC when Israel is about to be overthrown by the Babylonians. And so he's trying to warn them and remind them of the covenant that God made with Israel. And if they would just turn back to God, then things would be okay. And so the priest, the spiritual leader of God's people, hears Jeremiah prophesying these things and has him beaten and detained at the temple gates. And Jeremiah is humiliated and he's laughed at by those walking by. Then, after he's been detained, the king of Judah, the leader of God's people, hears Jeremiah's warnings and he doesn't accept them, so he throws him in prison. And shortly after his imprisonment, the city's officials get tired of hearing Jeremiah, and so they lower him into a cistern. But there's no water in this cistern, it's just mud. And so Jeremiah finds himself detained, imprisoned, and now sinking into the mud of a cistern, all because he's decided to be obedient to what God has asked him to do. So Jeremiah has finally had enough, and he decides, I just need to give God a piece of my mind. And so I'm paraphrasing, but what he says is God, I'm really tired of trusting you. Look at my life. I'm following you as best as I can, and look where that's gotten me. I thought following you would improve my life, but oh man, how I've been deceived. I bought it hook, line, and sinker. You know what? I wish I wasn't born. The doctor that delivered me, curse that guy. I hope he wakes up every morning to screaming and wailing. Needless to say, he's pretty upset, and rightfully so. And when we read stories like this in the Bible, we think, wait, why is this in here? This doesn't make you look good. I mean, this is God's prophet, God's chosen person to communicate on his behalf, and his life has kind of fallen apart, and he's crying out in frustration. And so why is it in there? Why does James reference it? Well, it's because there are going to be days where you feel like you're done with God. There are going to be days where you wish you would have honestly never started following him. But as Ethan shared, there's going to be days where you go, I've tried doing life differently. I tried sacrificing. I tried living selflessly, and instead of getting better, it just got worse. And so how do you kind of get through those moments? Well, according to James, you look to the prophets. I mean, they endured all kinds of suffering, but they decided to be consistently obedient. Jeremiah made that decision. The prophets, they were consistently obedient no matter what was happening around them. And so then James provides us with one more kind of example of patience, and he writes this in verse 11. He says, "As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about." Now, the story of Job, you might be familiar with it. What you would know is that Job is the most righteous man on earth. But Satan, he makes a bet with God that he can change that. And so a bunch of bad things start happening. For one, Job's family, they're meeting at this festival and the roof collapses and Job loses all his sons and daughters. And then there's this one time, where his entire land and his livestock, there's no one to watch it. And so intruders come and they take everything that he has. Job, he even breaks out in boils. I mean, he's sick in bed and his wife looks at him and she finally says, you're still keeping your integrity, eh? You better curse God and die. And she walks out on him. And so Job says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." And so Job, he goes on to gripe a lot more. I mean, he's discouraged, he's upset, he's angry. And so what is James communicating to us through this example of Job? What he's saying is that we are to bring our anger and our discouragement to God, like Job, not against him. It's okay to be discouraged about your Christian life. It's okay to be angry at God. Those are human emotions. Those are natural feelings. But like Job, that doesn't mean that we abandon God. Job never abandoned him. And so with that considered, James then says this. He concludes his thoughts by saying, "May I remind you that the Lord is full of compassion and mercy." You see, God understood the farmers, the prophets, and Job more than they understood themselves. And God understands your life, your discouragement, your anger, your suffering more than you do. And so what God wants to say is that I'm working this out. Just trust me. There's going to be a day when you're going to look back and you're going to be glad that you didn't throw in the towel. Just be patient through your suffering. It's going to be worth it. One day we're going to meet face to face and spend eternity together. And so stick it through. God's saying, work hard. Trust me. Don't give up. He's saying, be consistently obedient, not because things are getting better, but because you trust the work that I'm doing in the background. And finally, he says, bring your anger and frustrations to me. Don't bring them against me. Well, friends, hopefully you were patient enough to make it to this point in the video. Consider yourselves caught up and enjoy working through discussion questions. We'll see you next time.